It's a great honor to have Paul and Miya with us. So you've all read their bios, and brevity being the soul of wit, I will give the floor to Paul and then to Miya. So thanks again for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I'll try to remember to talk into the mic. I have a lot of slides, so I'm going to go very quickly through some of them, and we can talk more about them later. I'm going to divide this into, what happened, why it happened, and what it means, basically, with the midterm election. So we'll start with the basics, which most of you are probably familiar with. What happened? We had an election for both the House of Representatives and for approximately 1/3 of the U.S. Senate. 435 members of the House, you need 218 for a majority. The Democrats basically had 195 seats going in to the election, so they needed at least 23 to get to 218 to get their majority. They did much better than that. They have at least 35 seats, and several of the seats lately seem to be breaking for the Democrats in California. So they may have as many as 40 seats at the end of this. That's probably the top end, which means we're around 53 or 54% of the seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. That matches the popular vote fairly well for the House of Representatives, which actually surprises us a little bit because we thought that the Republicans, who controlled the majority of the state legislatures, had drawn districts that were favorable to them that would have meant the Democrats had to have a much larger percentage of the vote to get this kind of a percentage in the House of Representatives. And it'll be interesting to take a look back at this and see sort of why it actually worked the way it's supposed to work rather than the way we thought it would work in the House of Representatives. U.S. Senate, it was much more difficult for the Democrats because of the 1/3 of the seats that were up for re-election, most of them were Democratic seats. You see the numbers here. With the special elections added in, Democrats had to defend 26 out of the 49 seats that they had. So more than half of the seats they had to defend. Whereas Republicans, out of their 51, only had to defend 9 of them. So it was much easier for the Republicans than the Democrats to not only hold the Senate, but gain seats as they did. The numbers that are here, we're still counting some votes in Florida, for example. Arizona finally finished their counting, and the Democrats won Arizona. So I think these numbers will probably hold up. Most people expect that even with the recounts in Florida, the Republicans will hold that Senate seat, which wasn't expected. Okay, the one way the polls were off is the polls showed that the Democrats doing better in Florida than they actually ended up doing. They lost both the governor's race and the Senate race if the recounts turn out that way. And that was a little surprising, something to think about as you look at 2020, if we're not polling Florida very well. If you look at the percentages, I think that's what's interesting, in that the Democrats actually did better than the Republicans in the Senate elections, in that they won a larger percentage. They won 85% of the seats that they had to defend, and the Republicans only won about 78%, rounding it a little bit. So they ended up doing better, but because they had so much to defend, they ended up doing worse, right? And in the end, the Republicans are probably going to pick up 2 seats. So it'll be a 53-47, which is important from the Republicans' point of view, because now they're not as dependent on some of their more liberal members. Susan Collins, for example. If you have another Supreme Court vacancy, this would actually free her to vote against that person, thereby making her re-election easier, since she's about ready to go up for re-election. So the internal politics here are going to be interesting. My slide, that just shows you the different states. The Republicans, I don't know if this shows, picked up Indiana, Missouri, North Dakota, and it looks like Florida, so they picked up 3. The Democrats picked up Nevada and Arizona, so they picked up 2 from the other side. That's how you get the net 2 for the Republicans. So people in my business all talk about a blue wave, this term wave. Was it a blue wave or not? And I was on TV talking about this on election day, and I said it wasn't. I'm not sure. That's not a technical term. It's not an academic term. We don't really know what a wave is. Sean Trendy, who's very good at statistical analysis of elections, argues that to have a real wave, you have to look down ticket, so you have to look what happens at the states. And the Democrats did well at the state level, but not all over the place. In my home state of Ohio, for example, the Democrats did very poorly in this election. They did held the Senate seat, but they lost the governorship. They lost every statewide office. I mean, they already held those statewide offices, the Republicans did. And the Republicans held the legislature too. So down ticket, it was a very good election for the Republicans in Ohio. The Democrats did take back a few state legislatures. They gained a few governor seats. Again, we don't know whether it's a wave or not. One way to look at this, though, remember, when we're saying wave, we're talking about a political outcome. And we're trying to look at the political fortunes of a party, which may or may not be important when it comes to 2020, because midterms are very poor at predicting presidential elections. There's no correlation between what happens at midterms and what happens in general election and presidential elections. So I'm looking at the legislative outcome. How good was this for the Democrats in terms of legislation and policy? There were only 4 possible outcomes for last Tuesday's election, right? The best outcome for the Democrats would have been had they gained the House and the Senate, majorities in both, right? The worst outcome would have been if they stayed in the minority in both houses. The second best outcome, however, would have been for them to lose the House and win the Senate. Now, granted, this is unfair, right, because it was an uphill climb to win the Senate. But of the 2 houses of Congress, the Senate is more important. They're not equal. There's things that only the Senate gets to vote on. You know, for example, the executive offices. You know, if there's a vacancy, as there is now in the Attorney General's office, right, the Democrats would have loved to have had the opportunity to take on whoever President Trump nominates. But they really won't be able to do that now. Of course, Supreme Court nominations, which have been in the news, only the Senate plays a role. If we ever again decide to sign a treaty, right, since we don't do treaties, we do agreements in the United States. And it always kind of amuses me because I realize that often in other countries, you call what we call an agreement a treaty in terms of trade. But we call them all agreements because of the requirement of a 2/3 vote in the Senate. And we know we'll never get that kind of extraordinary support for any kind of trade agreement, for example, so we don't call it a treaty. But if we do enter into any treaties, only the Senate gets to participate in that. So arguably it's the more important house if we're going to have one of them. So what they ended up with was the 3rd best possibility, taking the House but not taking the Senate. So from a legislative perspective, this wasn't the worst outcome, but it was far from the best outcome. Now, you shouldn't have expected the best outcome, right? It would have been extraordinary if the Democrats had taken back the Senate, given the seats that were open. But nevertheless, in terms of legislative outcomes, it's not the equivalent to what we would see as a political wave. Why did it happen? Why did the election turn out the way it did? And the short answer is, I'm not sure. But we can take a look at some factors. First of all, it's a midterm election. The party in power always, almost always, loses seats in their first midterm election, in midterm elections in general. In fact, you know, political scientists, right, we call ourselves scientists, but we don't have many rules, right? We don't have many laws that can be reproduced. This is not physics. The one rule we have, though, is that most of the time, the party in power will lose seats in the House of Representatives. And you see here, it almost always happens. Virtually every president. What you also see here is you can't really take what happens at a midterm and use it to predict the future. Look at Ronald Reagan, right? Loses 26 seats in the House of Representatives. The Republicans do. Yet he goes on to a landslide victory in the next election. So you can't really make predictions. Why do presidents lose seats during midterm elections? Political scientists actually study this quite a bit. There's a lot of papers on this. And they've come up with basically 4 theories as to why this happens. And these are theories you might want to apply to this election to see if they make sense, if they work. The first is the coattails theory. You could maybe see that, for example, in 2008. President Obama certainly had coattails, meaning he pulled along some Democrats with him. It may be that voters didn't really know much about the Democratic candidate in their district or weren't excited about that candidate, but they were excited about Barack Obama, right? So they showed up to vote for Barack Obama, and while they were there, they voted for the Democratic candidate. Well, in 2010, Barack Obama was not on the ballot, so they weren't as motivated to show up. So those coattails aren't available. Also, you get the idea of the party overperforms then. You know, for example, they win seats they shouldn't win, meaning these are districts that aren't good, let's say, for Democrats, but they win because Obama's on the ballot. Without him there, they can't win those districts. And they really, you might say, shouldn't win those districts, meaning they're not districts that should be good for that political party. President Trump didn't have any coattails in 2016, right? He didn't really drag anybody along with him. In fact, in many races, the Republican candidate that won outperformed President Trump in the district. So you can't really use that as an explanation. The surge in decline. Weak partisans stay home during midterm elections. What we mean by weak partisans is these are people that are inclined to vote for one party or the other. But they're not very motivated to show up. You know, even in this election, we had about a 48% nationwide turnout. Presidential years, we get closer to 60%. This was a good turnout. Usually we get 40%. We're around 48%. But it's not 60%, right? So these weak partisans, people that aren't really habitual voters, they show up in presidential years. You have the surge, but then they decline. They're not available to you in non-presidential years. The referendum theory, that voters are evaluating the president. There certainly was something to that, right, in this election. And oftentimes the reason presidents lose, by the way, is that people are overly excited when they elect someone. Americans aren't very good at understanding our own Constitution and realizing the limitations on the presidency. You run for president in the United States by promising to fix everyone's problems. And then their problems don't get fixed, as much as the president might want to try. So voters, by the midterm, are disappointed. They're not happy with the results. All their problems didn't go away. The president isn't on the ballot, so they take it out on the president's party in Congress. The problem with this theory is that we also know that, generally speaking, presidents get reelected. So the problem with the referendum theory is that they're so disappointed 2 years into a presidency, why aren't they equally disappointed 4 years into a presidency when they are inclined to reelect who's ever already in office? Recently, political scientists have emphasized what's called the presidential penalty. That basically, in a midterm election, the party is penalized because of who's in office. The presidential election is still on people's minds 2 years in. And the winners are not as motivated as the losers. So, you know, President Trump supporters, they were excited. They were motivated in 2016 to elect Donald Trump. But they won. They might be happy they won. But now, 2 years later, they're not as emotional about it as the losers are, right? Democrats in the United States are mad, right? They thought they had this election won. All the polls showed they were going to win, and they lost. And they've been angry since, you know, the day of the election. They were waiting for this opportunity to get back at Donald Trump and the Republicans. They were going to show up, and you see it with enthusiasm. It was high for Republicans, in part because President Trump tried to make it as high as possible. That's why he did all these rallies. You realize he did over 40 rallies from March of last year to October of this year. Unheard of this kind of political rallies for a sitting president. But what he was trying to do is get his side as excited as he knew the other side was going to be. Also, we think that some voters simply want to balance out the president. So it doesn't matter who the president is. They're going to vote for the other side because they're nervous about a president accruing too much power. So under this theory, it really doesn't matter what the president does or who the president is. Any president is going to be penalized simply because they won the last election. And that's probably a big part of what we saw last Tuesday. Looking at the exit polls, and you have to be very careful with exit polls. What we discovered in 2016 in particular is that they weren't very accurate when we went back and have other kind of surveys that we look at. But it is kind of a rough measure, and it shows you that 40% of the people who showed up, 38%, opposed Trump, and they overwhelmingly voted for Democrats. Those who supported Trump, of course, voted for him, but there were only 26% of those. Those voters for whom Trump wasn't a factor, maybe they were lying. It was a factor one way or the other, but they did tend to trend towards Republicans. Again, the data doesn't really give us a clear picture. This one kind of does, the gender gap. This is extraordinary, right? The gap between males and females, and of course, females outvote men. We know that in the United States. It's been that way for quite a bit of time, that women show up to vote in a higher percentage than men do. And if you're losing the female vote by 20%, you're going to have a very hard time winning an election. And you know, the Me Too movement, the hearings for Brett Kavanaugh, this really energized women against the Republicans. And I think it was a very big factor in this election. You also saw it in women running for office. This was a record year of women deciding to stand for election. We've always known that when women ran for office, the probability of them winning was just the same as the probability of a male candidate. There was no bias against voting for a female candidate. The problem was females did not seek office. They didn't want to get involved in politics. It seems that President Trump has driven them to get involved in politics. And so we see a record number of women running, mostly Democrats, but some Republicans also. In the Arizona election, right, that was just decided, it was two female candidates against each other. And we saw that there were a couple other Senate races that were like that also, with two female candidates running. In the end, there will be a record number of women serving in the 116th Congress. 112, right, out of 535, if you take the House and the Senate. So it's still not even close to 50%, but it's the highest number that we've ever had in the United States. We're not sure about this election, right, but in California's 39th district, Young Kim is ahead now, and she would be the first Korean-American woman ever elected to Congress. That race is really closing as they're finishing up the counting, though, so she may end up not winning that race. And again, she ran as a Republican. Ed Royce vacated that seat, and she actually had worked for Royce, and also I believe has a television show and a radio show out there, so she's very well known. Gerrymandering. I don't have time to talk about this in detail, but gerrymandering is when we draw districts to achieve a particular political result. And in most states, the districts were drawn to favor Republicans. However, we've had some court decisions. Most recently in the state of Pennsylvania. The Democrats probably gained 3 or 4 seats simply because the districts were redrawn in the state of Pennsylvania. That was a state Supreme Court decision, which means it only affected Pennsylvania. There were 2 other cases that came up to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court sent them back to be reheard again. Justice Kennedy was sympathetic to these arguments that gerrymandering is a violation of the federal Constitution. We're not sure if Justice Kavanaugh feels the same way, so we don't know what the reception will be for those. But it made a difference, at least in Pennsylvania, and gave the Democrats some extra seats, and maybe why the popular vote and the outcome in terms of seats seem to match up this time. Suburban switch. One of the problems I think Republicans faced is they lost the suburban vote. Now, suburban is too general of a category, but particularly if you look at wealthy, non-rural, non-urban districts, if you look at the richest House districts, right, in 10 states, that just means it's the richest district in each state, the wealthiest district, flipped from Republican to Democratic. And I was actually raised in one of those districts, in New Jersey's 7th Congressional District. That's the district I grew up in. And I will tell you, when I was growing up, the Democratic Party did not exist. It was purely Republican, but these were Wall Street Republicans. It's a commuter place to New York City, so a lot of the New York City money was based there. It's where Trump's golf club is, actually, and always voted for Republicans. It switched this time and voted for Democrats. Those are the kind of voters I think that Trump has turned off. And he's gotten the working class voters, but those districts were not drawn for working class voters. They were drawn for a Republican Party that had a lot of these wealthier sort of voters who didn't like taxes or regulations and tended to support Republicans because of that. So we'll see with redistricting whether you see very different lines than you saw before if we're still going to do sort of political districting. Education, we know that college graduates are trending towards Democrats, whereas before they trended more towards Republicans. It used to be that only people with graduate degrees tended to vote for Democrats. But overall, people with a college education would support Republicans. In fact, this gave Republicans often an advantage because people with more education are more likely to vote than people with a lower education. But the party is changing. If you combine gender and education, we don't have time to go through all of this, but I think these are some really interesting numbers. Is when you look at the gender cap, it seems to be driven mostly by educated women, who again are most likely to vote or more likely to vote. We can go back to these slides later if during questions you want to examine them more. What does it mean? For 2020, if we kind of take a look at the map and use what happened in the Senate, and again, we didn't have Senate races in a majority of the states, but the ones we did, and try to take that to mean how the states will vote in 2020, you see that the Democrats have a narrow advantage. I gave the Republicans Ohio because of what happened statewide, even though Sherrod Brown, the senator, won that race. Florida also because of how well the Republicans did in those two Senate races, or the Senate race and the gubernatorial race. The Democrats, Arizona and Nevada, because they took those two states. The Republicans get Montana, even though they didn't oust John Tester in that state. So you see where we're at. Now, what if, though, we make a slight switch in this and give the Republicans Pennsylvania? We have a very interesting map. We have a tie. Because there's 538 electoral votes, you have the possibility of a tie, which would then go actually to the House of Representatives to decide. They would vote by state, by the way, which means all those Democrats in California get one vote for president. And it will be the new Congress that would vote, by the way, not the current Congress. So in 2020, when people are voting, they are actually voting for president and for the tiebreaker, even though they might not realize it. A lot depends on who runs. And, you know, this is just a partial. I ran out of room on the slide. You know, it's easier to name what Democrats not going to run for president than the ones that are talking about running for president. You know, it's an open race. There's no natural front runner right now. We don't know whether Joe Biden will run. He looks like the front runner now, but Biden has run for president twice and has never been more popular than the day before he declares for office. And that often is the case with candidates. Hillary Clinton was much more popular before she declared she was a candidate. She was very, very popular. So, you know, we don't know how this is going to pan out. A lot of people are talking about Sherrod Brown today. I just got interviewed about him because, again, he won in a red state, in Ohio, where Trump won by 9 points. In terms of talking about trade, that's very interesting in that Sherrod Brown is more anti-trade than Donald Trump is. Those debates would be very, very interesting. I think with one candidate, saying, I'll take your 20% tariff and raise you 5%. But it would take the issue off the board for Donald Trump. And I think that's what the Democrats are seeing and why they're attracted to Brown, and that trade was a very big issue in the Midwest. You can't out anti-trade Sherrod Brown. So that would give the Democrats a very good shot at taking all those Midwestern states and winning the election. I already told you a little bit about turnout. We're running out of time here. Let's just look at the really important issue. Trade. Trump tweeted on election night, or the next day, that he was happy. He felt he won the election, and now you can't wait him out on trade, which he suspected foreign countries were doing, hoping that he'd do poorly in this election. Remember, he did hold the Senate. Just last night, we had a series of tweets that came out about trade, again, tying it to what we pay, what he says we pay for military overseas, basically saying we're spending all this money to protect other countries and they're ripping us off on trade, and he's going to do something about it. Free and fair trade, he says. In terms of what will happen in the next Congress, the 116th, the important thing to look at are the committees in the House of Representatives, realizing that overall there's not a lot the Democrats are going to be able to do. It takes two houses to pass legislation. They only have one of them. In terms of trade, most power has already been given away to the president, and once Congress gives something away, it's very, very difficult to take back that power. And remember, President Trump can veto anything that the Democrats in Congress decide to do, and they don't have the votes to override that veto. Moreover, I'm not sure they're going to be inclined to do very much to rein in President Trump on trade. The House Armed Services Committee, that will change. We'll see what that does for the military, but again, it's one house. This will probably not influence trade very much. This one's going to be big. Adam Schiff is outspoken, likes to be on TV. He will be holding hearings every week. He will be on CNN every day. This will really cause a lot of difficulties for Donald Trump with the investigations. Nunes was much more of a friend. Foreign Affairs, Eliot Engel also likes to be on TV. And he has already told us that he's going to start investigating Trump's international properties and how that affects U.S. foreign policy. Again, these are just investigations, though. It's just oversight. It doesn't really change policy, but it makes things more difficult for the president. It puts him in a much more difficult political environment, particularly depending on what happens with the Mueller report. Senate Foreign Relations could actually be really interesting, even though we didn't see a change in the Senate, is if James Risch doesn't want the position, it'll be Marco Rubio, who I think would be very interesting as a chair for Senate Foreign Relations. As you know, he came to Japan a couple years ago and basically announced a change in U.S. policy with regard to the Senkaku Islands. And Robert's booting me off stage. We'll talk about this in a minute if you want to talk about trade. Two big committees for trade are Ways and Means and Senate Finance. And in the House Ways and Means, Richard Neal appears to be someone not very supportive of free trade. This could mean bad things for the revised NAFTA agreement. Here is a tweet from the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Trade, which will be the first to get their hands on the new renegotiated NAFTA. And this person was not, Dave Reichert, was not a fan of TPP, for example. Tweeting on election day, this was right after Trump got elected, celebrating the fact that Trump was going to withdraw from TPP. So it's really interesting in that if you look at public opinion polls, last thing I'll say, the Democrats are more in favor now of free trade than the Republicans are. But that's the voters or the people that are being polled. In terms of the parties, the leadership of the party, the Democrats are more opposed to free trade than the Republicans. So, you're getting people on these committees whose position is closer to Donald Trump's, than the Republican who left the position. So it's going to be very interesting for trade to see how this works out. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much for coming to this session. I am Miya Shichinohe-Suga of Tokioka University, and I am the expert. I'm not an expert of the U.S. politics, but I am a historian, U.S. Census historian, and also I am a historian on Japanese American, Asian American migration. I thought when I got the invitation from Robert to have a talk on this panel, I would be contributing to this session by talking about how young students of mine see U.S. politics and issues of immigration and minorities through the lens of America. You might not heard of our university, Tokyo Gakugei University, TGU. It's #1 top ranking in terms of education course. But we also have another course, which is education specialist course, which I am affiliated with, multicultural education department. And when I got the post as tenured professor at TGU, I instantly fell in love with the students because they are so serious and so dedicated to work, and they are from various kinds of places. For example, you have 21 each from Hokkaido, from Kagoshima, as well as 11 from Okinawa. Of course, we have largest number of students coming from Tokyo area, but we also have second largest number of students from Aichi. So we have a bunch of variety of students in my university, and the university site is very small, so it's really friendly and very small-sized, cozy atmosphere I really liked. And over the course of years that I teach at TGU, I have noticed that the vast majority of the students don't know that Japan was once a nation to send immigrants to overseas, to Hawaii. This year actually marks the 150th anniversary of Ganemono, the first immigrant to Hawaii at Meiji, first Meiji year. And next year will be another 150th anniversary of Japanese migrants to continental US, to California, El Dorado, from Aizu Wakamatsu. But those histories, vast majority of the students, even if they are from Hiroshima or Yamaguchi, that sent so many migrants to Hawaii and United States, don't know. So therefore, their knowledge about Japanese Americans, first generation Issei and second generation Issei were put in internment camps during World War II. They don't know these histories at all, almost. And similarly, a vast majority of the students don't know the fact that the Japanese Empire was once a multi-ethnic nation. So although the knowledge and interest in the midterm election is small, but they have shown a keen interest in the 2016 presidential election and America generally. United States is still #1 favorite place to study abroad, both short terms and long terms. Oops. And so I asked my students of my seminar and classrooms several questions, wondering if Mr. Trump has become the biggest symbol of the United States. And the answer is yes. When I asked this question #1, when you hear the word America, list 10 words that comes to your mind. Out of 70 students I interviewed, 20% of the students said Trump, followed by 9% saying that Obama symbolizes America. But that followed by Statue of Liberty, 6%, hamburger, 6%, and New York, also 6%. And also the concept or idea of freedom is 5%, and 3% wrote entries such as issues of immigration. And you notice that this you notice that although these actual people, Mr. Trump and Mr. Obama, symbolizes strongly of America, but 40%, 45% of the students say other entries, bunch of varieties of entries were found. And if you compare among top 5 answers, then the share of other answers will go up. So, whoops, we'll still have hamburger, immigration, Statue of Liberty, New York, followed by Mr. Trump and Obama, but other entries, numbers of other entries are going up. And so, yes, yes, Mr. Trump has become one of the biggest symbols of the United States, but places, principles, historical sites, food, culture, and companies like Amazon.com or McDonald's is also a company name, represent the US. But Mr. Trump, incumbent president, we see him on TV almost every day in Japanese media as well. So when you look at this Pew Research Center report of last year, many people in Japan are critical, disapprove of the idea of build a wall on the border between US and Mexico. 80% of the Japanese disapproved that idea. And many Japanese, 80%, see Trump as arrogant, not elegant, arrogant, intolerant, and dangerous. Then I asked the second question to my students. When you criticize Trump's America, what about us? By assigning the article by Gideon Reichman on Financial Times, he basically says that his ideas about race and immigration policy are nasty, but that's widely shared, not just in America. Japan accepted only 28 refugees in the whole 2016, and precisely 3 in the first half of 2017. So I asked this question to my students. Once again, 70 students answered. And what do you make of this opinion? 46% of the students agree with the argument by Reichman, and 11% each either disagree or can't compare the two countries. So one student wrote a very long comments after saying, yes, I agree with this argument, saying that she had a friend from India in her elementary school days, and she always brought a lunchbox instead of school lunch served in the classroom, because, and that was the reason why she was bullied, and she eventually left the school. So she really almost, in tears, remembered those days bitterly, and feel angry about teacher who was not against our prejudice, and even created the impression that she was a nuisance. So she said she read an article, that Japan was like snail. Do you know snail? Doraemon's character on the right. Middle center figure is a character, protagonist, Nobita, and the left is a giant, bullying guy. So she said that Japan is like snail, doesn't do anything in particular in a strong way, but assist bad things in a sneaky way. And she feels so bad about Japanese poor behavior to discuss issues of minorities and blame others without self-reflection. And here's another opinion that agrees with the Gideon Reichman's argument, saying that when you think about our reality, we must accept more foreign workers. The number of foreign immigrants increase, so I'm sure that Trump, like America, should not be our model. I will go back to this slide later on, because she interchangeably used the word foreign workers and foreign immigrants. And then here is an opinion that said we can't compare two countries because, in a good sense or bad sense, Japan's discrimination is shallower than the United States. So I do not think the discrimination in these two countries is on the same level. And here goes another can't compare to countries opinion. And talking about immigration, recently there was the poll conducted by Nikkei Asian Review asking about whether or not you approve of having more foreign workers, and 54% of Japanese in favor of it. But there is a gender gap, and there is a generation gap. 65% of those 18 to 29 backed the visas, with 76 supporting legal residency for qualified workers. So from my own conversation, dialogue with younger generation, I found that they are more realistic, flexible, not necessarily open-minded, but not ideological. And very few are interested in working in the industry such as fishery or agriculture because there are other jobs available to them, but they know that someone has to support this industry which lack laborers. And a male student of mine last year has written a very good graduation thesis, and in order to write his own thesis, he has volunteered to work with technical trainees from China on vegetable farms in Ibaraki. He is an athlete. He's slim, but he really is a strong guy. But that guy said that the work is too hard and could not keep doing it. So many male students like him said that the work is too hard, but somebody has to support those industries such as agriculture. So now, when we had the similar panel like this, after the presidential election 2 years ago, Robert, where is Robert? Robert, Robert asked me to talk about the possibility of having a female prime minister in Japan, because we all assume that we're going to have Hillary Clinton elected on that night. We're going to have session. So I was prepared to talk about this topic 2 years ago, but we talked a whole bunch of different things on the night. But 2 years later, is there a possibility that Japan will have a female prime minister in the near future? Was my third question to the students. Once again, 70 answered. And no answer was 63%, and yes was 36%. It was actually a big surprise for me because I expected the yes answer would be much lower. And more than 60% of students see the possibility is very small. When you look at the second one, no, there are few media representation women in politics, and women themselves don't think it's an issue. A country where the Me Too movement has not spread will not have a female prime minister in the future. And they go on the negative side of the opinion. Most cabinet ministers and presidents are men, so Japanese society cannot treat men and women fairly unless our awareness changes. But then again, 4% are positive of the idea of female prime minister. And we have Riko Koike, the first female governor of Tokyo. The power of women is increasing, so there is a great possibility of political equity. And there was a very interesting opinion by a freshman student, and then she said, actually that was she, and she said there is, I think, these days more and more female members in the Diet, and then there was a chance to choose a female prime minister about 30 years ago, so why not now? People these days really want gender equality. I am certain that Japan will have a female prime minister in the near future, was her very strong opinion. And finally, talking about the diversity, according to the Pew Research Center report, once again, many Japanese feel if we have more ethnic and religious and racial diversity in Japan, they think Japan will become a worse place to live. 47% of the answer goes, it's going to be a worse place to live in. But then again, there is a generation gap. 44% of Japanese 18 to 20 say diversity make for a better country. Only 17 of those ages 50s and older. And then I haven't done a comprehensive survey or dialogue with this particular topic with my students, but temporarily I can safely say that the 2 out of 40 students say diversity makes Japan a worse place. And now we already have increasing number of foreign residents in Japan. And I come back to this panel, as a slide, saying that the students who wrote these comments are not ignorant. They know the words' origins and meanings, but they interchangeably use these words. Foreign workers, foreign immigrants, they don't care. They just use these words interchangeably. That's what I have noticed among their comments and essays. And we already have increasing number of immigrant children at schools. You see the still Portuguese background students are the largest number, but we also see the increasing number of Chinese background students. But we also see the Filipinos and Vietnamese background students are also very much it is increasing too. And also we see this from this graph, you see that the Aichi prefecture has the largest number of the students who require Japanese language support in elementary school, junior high, but also in high schools. So we have these large number of foreign background immigrant children in Aichi and Osaka and Kanagawa, Tokyo, but also in Shizuoka and Miya as well. And Gunma, of course, yes. So finally, I'm going to introduce a little bit of my classes and case studies done at our classes at TGU. I just had a class yesterday, and the students really did a great presentation on these specific issues. And in particular, on the topic number 2, when the children are not fluent in both languages, native language and the learning language, assisting their understanding properly is very difficult and important issue, because it's very difficult to assess properly whether or not it's a language barrier or developmental issue. So, So what we have found through our field research, we have heard so many positive views on immigration from various groups. For example, Kyoiku Inkai, educational board members, or NGOs, NPOs at local prefectural level. Some of them even said that immigrant parents are more keen in education because because of the service available to the students is a very important point where they live. So they choose us because we provide good services to the immigrant children. So sometimes they are more keen in education than average Japanese parents. So I finally, I like to advocate this thing to my colleagues and everyone in my school, that all future elementary school teachers and education specialists study abroad at least for 1 month. So thank you very much. And if you're interested in coming to observe our classes or have dialogue with our students, you're always welcome, and hope to have continued discussion on those issues, on these issues. Thank you very much.
So I have a question for the gentleman. One of the big bills one of the big propositions that are ballot initiatives that I think fell under the radar was the reenfranchisement of certain convicted Florida voters. Does that affect the outcome, again, for Marco Rubio's Senate seat as well as the flipping Florida potentially in a presidential election?
We don't know. It is interesting. And of course, we probably could find some data because every state does not disenfranchise people who've been convicted of felonies. For example, Ohio, the state I live in, does not. One of the really interesting things about the United States is that we have 51 different set of election rules, right? You can live in one state and be allowed to vote and move to another state and not be allowed to vote anymore. So, it's not that every state disenfranchises people who've served their prison time. But you're right, now it's changing in Florida. Rubio was just reelected, so he's got a long time before he has to stand for election again. But, whether it'll, Florida's a swing state. And I would argue, although you were taping this, so I shouldn't, that Florida is the most important swing state. Even though I live in Ohio, and will remind you that no one's ever been elected president since 1960 who's not won the state of Ohio. We have to say that, it's in the contract. But Florida has more electoral votes than Ohio does. If you lose Florida and you're a Republican, there's really no path to victory. So what you're asking is the answer is very important. We don't know what it is. But, certainly if Florida is trending Republican, that's good for Donald Trump. If these new voters come in and vote, remember most, new voters don't vote. So, once you're reenfranchised, whether the first thing on your mind is going to be, I want to go register to vote, we'll see. There'll have to be a lot of outreach efforts. You're probably more interested in trying to get a job first, and then, figuring out whether you're going to vote. So we don't know what those numbers are going to look like.
Let me
Thank
take
you.
advantage. Thank you. Let me take advantage of Mike. Miya, how many of your students do you think vote? How interested are they in voting, and what are their politics?
Well, it's kind of a sensitive issue to ask who you voted. I always encourage them to vote before the election because I teach American history, and when you look at the American history, the voting rights was not given but won, right? And then you have to register to vote. The system is so different from yours because you automatically receive, here is the election coming, you have to go this place, community center or a certain place to vote, So you don't have to register to vote. But the interest in election, generally speaking, is low. And I asked my students, we have several students of mine in this floor, and I had a conversation about it, and some of the reason why they are not enthusiastic or energized to vote is that it's like an old man's business. It's not really relating to them because all those politicians are old men. So it's not really energizing the feelings or emotions or, the guts, or something like that. So they say that they are envy of the US politics because you have so much younger politicians available as a choice. So, for example, the 29-year-old Ocasio-Cortez from New York is such a symbol that youngsters really got energized, but we don't have such similar figure in the US, in Japan. That's one of the reasons why they got really not energized to vote. And then nothing can change, nothing can be changed. It's kind of apathy that the Japanese students don't necessarily care about voting or not really got involved in politics in general.
And Paul, what about your students?
Well, I do want to say that in my class at Waseda, I have about 40 students, and I actually asked the same question. I asked them if they voted, and 3 students raised their hand. Now, Japanese students don't raise their hand anyway, so it could be very inaccurate.
So did you ask who didn't vote, and then also 3 raised the same ones raised their hand?
No, because then we talked about the process, though, and it was funny, they were disagreeing on the process to vote, so I wasn't sure whether they actually did or not. But my students, well, we know that, Well, you know, I have a poor sample, right? Because I teach political science classes. So the students in my class are very energized. They're very involved. You know, they volunteer. But we know that overall in the U.S., young people don't vote. And, you know, we thought this election maybe was going to be different, but so far the numbers don't look that different. It still looks like very low turnout. In selected places it went up, certainly went up in Texas. And we saw that. We don't know the final numbers, but at least in early voting, Beto O'Rourke was very popular with young people in Texas. So that drove it up. But in 2008, with Obama, we really thought that we were going to see a big jump in youth voting because they were very, excited. And the Democrats did everything they could to get young people to vote. I remember at my university, what they did is they hired buses, and they drove them up to the university, and Hollywood movie stars would come, and they'd get on the buses, and the students would get on the bus, to meet the movie star, and they'd drive, over to the polls to get them to vote. So they did everything they could to drive up turnout, but in the end, it didn't go up very much, even with President Obama.
So they just stayed in the bus with the movie star. More questions? Don't be shy. Yeah, raise your hand. Yeah, here it is, in the back. In the back and then in the front.
So I have a question for Miya, actually. So I am actually 4th generation Japanese American. And when I first came to Japan, it was really hard trying to communicate to people who I am. And it felt really kind of lonely, So I made a group, actually. And we have like 150 members across Japan. And we're like, Japanese American and Kikoku Shijo, kind of, because they also kind of feel kind of in between. And I think 20 members are active in Tokyo. And so I have 2 questions. So my first question is, what do you think is our place in Japanese society? Kind of a heavy question, sorry. And then my other question is, how can we communicate to Japanese people that we exist and that we're not just Futsu Amerikajin, we're Nikkeijin.
I think the Irene Hirano, Irene Inoue Hirano, who was once the executive director of Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, now had the initiative to have the Young Japanese American Leadership Program, exchange program, recruiting and asking Japanese Americans from all over the U.S. to come over to Japan, have discussion and symposium throughout the Japan, to have like a face-to-face discussion with the Japanese in Japan. And I think that's one of the political or initiative initiated by the Irene Hirano Japanese American. And because the Japanese government and the Japanese Americans try to ask for the Japanese Americans' help as an interpreter or cultural ambassador, the bridge between 2 countries. So it's kind of old model, but they are, once again, try to do that because Japanese Americans don't necessarily know about the Japanese history, right? Because you're already 4th generation, or 5th generation, 6th generation. So the Japanese-ness is really sort of decreasing because of the intermarriage among Japanese American is really widespread, right? So the Nikkei's face is really changing. It's not necessarily pure Japanese blood, Japanese Americans, but the Nikkei-ness is really changing. So Japanese American side also wanted to have more awareness among Japanese American to have historical knowledge of Japan. So that kind of mutual interest meet or match, and they have this intellectual or cultural exchange programs, very active every year. So if you want to participate in those symposium or events, you might already have heard of that event or symposium. I can give you some address and contact person to participate. But it's very, long answer to your question, but when I was a Japanese student studying in United States, that was right after LA riot occurred, 1991, UCLA. And we have heated discussion about Japan was like buying out the US. So Japan bashing and was very heated. So we had a very direct confrontation among my fellow Japanese American, Asian American students that because of you, because of Japan is so aggressive and try to buy the symbolic Rockefeller Center, we are victimized. We got killed even by hate crimes, like Vincent Chin got killed in Detroit. So, but having the open discussion really made us to become really friends. So if you feel that you have a barrier between Japanese and Japanese Americans, but you confront them, you have discussions, and you have honest, discussion, then you probably have less barrier between you emotionally, psychologically. So I'm only assuming, it's only it's, real difficult to answer your personal experiences, but my advice to you is that keep your identity as American, and then try to explain how Japanese Americans have felt in Japan. We're not Japanese. We may look Japanese, but we are Japanese American. Then I will teach you about Japanese American history during the World War II, or our history went back all the way 150 years ago in Hawaii, in California, El Dorado. So you teach them, because they don't know all the history of Japanese immigration to Hawaii, Brazil, Canada, Australia. So you teach them, please.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Hank. I'm from graduate student from International Christian University. So I have a question for Mr. Sracic. So we see that many states in the West America, like Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona, they showing sign that they will vote Democratic Party, even though in the past they vote for Republican Party. And some states in the Midwest, like Ohio, your home state, will vote more for Republican than Democratic. So do you think this kind of change, what is the implication is to campaign strategy, and does it bring advantage for Democratic Party or Republican Party in the future?
Well, there's already, there was a discussion today. The gubernatorial candidate in Ohio, Richard Cordray, who worked for the Obama administration, his campaign manager came out and basically said, you shouldn't focus on Ohio anymore. Ohio's not a swing state. The states that we think of as swing states are evolving. And part of that is demographics. I don't think it's an accident that you're starting to see a state like Arizona become more competitive, because you're getting more Hispanic voters in those states. And right now, at least Hispanic Americans are voting more Democratic. Texas will be very interesting. It was much closer between Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz for that Senate race than we expected. However, we always used to say there were sort of two states that would break the hearts of the parties. Texas is the state that breaks the heart of Democrats, because they keep thinking they're going to win Texas, and they don't. And Pennsylvania, for a long time, broke the hearts of Republicans, right? Because Republicans always thought they could grab Pennsylvania, and they kept losing Pennsylvania. Now, Donald Trump did win, sort of by a very narrow margin. So who knows? This might be the time where we're hitting the tipping point for Texas. And that's really the big state, because if Democrats end up winning, they already win in California. If they win in Texas, there's no chance for a Republican to be elected if our two largest states with the most electoral votes are now Democratic states. So, it is going to change. California, we now think of as an automatic, blue state. But remember, when we say blue and red, by the way, those of you that don't watch American networks or whatever, it's blue are Democratic states, red are Republican states. The media decided that, by the way. It's not scientific. And it always, I give a lot of lectures in Europe, and it always amuses them that Republicans are the red party. Okay, there. But again, California, Ronald Reagan came out of California. California used to be a swing state, used to be somewhat of a Republican state, and now it's moved to being a we all know that, I can predict, in 2020, I don't know we got about 25 Democrats that might run, but whoever runs is going to win California, right? We know that before we even hold the election. That's how democratic of a state it's become, when it used to be a swing state. So this is always, kind of in motion. The Republicans would say, well, what about Michigan and Wisconsin? Are they moving kind of in the same way? Are they becoming more, Republican states? But of course, that's not going to balance out Texas if that shifts. But we don't really know about Texas. Hillary Clinton spent money in Texas in 2016. Didn't, in the final, I think it was 7 weeks or whatever, she spent no money in Wisconsin, and she spent money in Texas. So chasing Texas is kind of a dangerous thing for Democrats. And remember, a lot of elections, nobody wins, somebody loses, right? A lot of voters are voting against rather than voting for. And when you have a Ted Cruz, who's not a very charismatic candidate, let's just say, right? He doesn't, and so I think you had a lot of voters who kind of voted against him, as well as those who voted for O'Rourke. So when somebody else is on the ballot, we'll have to see, whether that's really becoming a Democratic state.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ken Moskowitz here, TUJ. I just wanted to ask a question for both speakers. I got the impression from what you said about youth voting, they didn't really turn out at this midterm, and maybe because the candidates were too old. But I was thinking about some earlier elections. Eugene McCarthy in '68 and Bernie Sanders, of course, in the last cycle. They're not necessarily younger. They could be old, but they just have either idealism or youth-oriented issues that young people agree with. I wonder what research or analysis tells you about the way to appeal to the young voters.
I don't know if we have any. I mean, I'm sure there is some good research. I'm not, frankly, I'm not sure about it. I'm not aware of it. But just sort of anecdotally, I think the Sanders phenomenon was really, really interesting in 2016. I mean, I can't tell you how many students were sitting in my classes with "Feel the Burn" T-shirts on. They were really, really excited. And I think, in the end, that actually helped Donald Trump, because these voters, they really, really like Sanders. They weren't just, okay, I'm going to vote for him. They were excited to vote for him. And they saw Hillary Clinton as the person who denied them their candidate. And that made them much less motivated in the general election in 2016 to show up and vote for her. And many of them, actually, what they did is that they showed up, they voted Green Party or Libertarian. And that was in part because they were mad at her, but it was also because the polls were showing that she was going to win anyway. So they thought, why do I need to vote for her? She's going to win anyway. I might as well, show my protest, right, by voting. So, he clearly did have an effect. But I think you're right. An older person can get these young voters excited depending upon their message. Young voters like an out-of-the-mainstream message, right? They're more idealistic. So they like somebody that comes in. I will tell you, when Dennis Kucinich, you might not know that name, right, from Cleveland, when he ran for president, didn't really have much of an impact. But when he came to my university, it was packed, because Dennis was more radical when he came in, and that's what they're looking for.
Yeah. I'd also throw in Rand Paul, the same sort of effect.
Exactly. And in fact, when you talk to young voters, if you ask them, is there any Republican who you would vote for? Because they tend to be Democrat, they all say Rand Paul. You're right. He's very popular, in part because in terms of foreign policy, at least, right, he's not the standard Republican line. And I think, again, that's what they're looking for, somebody who's different, who stands out. And that's what you'll have to be. I mean, there's a lot of potential candidates in the Democratic Party in 2020. So, we'll see. Now, the other thing to realize, I think the 2020 Democratic primary is going to really be fascinating. And it's going to start very soon, by the way, by this summer, right? You'll start having debates. Not only the number of candidates, but you should realize that the Democratic Party has gotten rid of superdelegates. And that is a very big... Well, okay, so at the national convention, right, when they nominate their their party's standard bearer. Many of the people there historically are elected during the primaries, but a certain number are there because of the position that they hold. So you'll have a Democratic member of Congress who's what we call a superdelegate. They get to go to the convention no matter who votes for them. And
vote.
I'm sorry?
In other words, they go to the convention and they vote.
They go to the convention and they vote, and what they tend to be is sort of they balance the system. The Democrats did this because they didn't want to end up nominating a candidate who was unelectable. They were a bit afraid of their own primary voters. They'd nominate somebody who was too far left for the general public. So you brought these superdelegates in who would know, because they were party leaders, party officials. They would know what to do and would push back. Neither, Barack Obama nor Hillary Clinton, Obama in 08 and Clinton in 16, had enough delegates to get the nomination just from the elected delegates. They needed these superdelegates to come in. And, in 2008, Hillary Clinton claimed that she was cheated because the superdelegates, gave Barack Obama the nomination because they thought he was more electable. Now, the fact is he was ahead in delegates, but he didn't have the majority that you needed. The same thing happened with Bernie Sanders. Clinton is ahead, but she doesn't have the majority without the superdelegates coming in part because there were so many of them. Well, now we've thrown it wide open, right, because the Democrats don't have those superdelegates. Also, what Democrats do, unlike Republicans, is they don't have winner-take-all primaries. So that means you get a certain percentage of the vote, you get a certain percentage of the delegates. Put that together with the fact that you might have 15 or 20 candidates running, many of whom are going to get some delegates, and we're on our way to a brokered convention, which none of us have ever seen, who are alive now. So, we're kind of looking forward to it, but also it makes you a little bit nervous, right, to see, what's going to happen. It makes it very difficult to predict who the candidate's going to be. And could the Democrats end up nominating somebody who is simply unelectable? Because that's what the superdelegates were intended to stop. Now they're not going to be there anymore. The Republicans have never had them. But again, Republicans have winner-take-all primaries for the most part. They can settle things a little bit earlier than Democrats have been able to. That's not your question, but.
You want to?
Oh, sorry.
Well, just out of our conversation with the students, I also kept thinking about who would be Bernie Sanders in Japan. Do you, in the floor, please help me if you think of anyone who can become like a Bernie Sanders, who can energize the Japanese youngsters in Japan?
Even as when as Bernie Sanders appear in Japan, probably be crushed. Crushed, I think.
No, I'm not necessarily talking about the Bernie Sanders.
I know.
That someone who can energize the younger generation to come up and vote. Can you think of anyone?
Younger Koizumi?
Younger Koizumi, yeah, it can be, yes. And question or?
Sorry, I was just going to add to that.
Yeah.
I don't think the problem in Japan is whether there's a person to fill that Bernie Sanders role, but what are the policies that a progressive leader would follow. In America, in Europe, we have gender identity, race relations, growing economic inequality, which is happening here too. But if you are that Japanese Bernie Sanders, what are the policies that are going to appeal to young people in Japan? Because off the top of my head, I can't really think of any. They're going to get them excited.
Because the economic condition now is good and the employment opportunities for the students are very, very good. So a lot of jobs available to students, so they don't really have the urgent issues now in front of them. So that's why we don't really have the students who are divisive on issues like this issue or that issue. But some of the students chose Abe because he is a strong leader. And so some of the students really yearn for a strong leader like Trump, actually. And it's not a very positive choice, but out of the negative choice. And because when they were elementary school students or maybe younger, the Japanese prime minister changes so often. So those students felt ashamed of changing so many prime minister often, too often. So to see him on G7 summit regularly, consecutive years, make them feel very good about him because he symbolizes Japan as like a strong leader and sustainable or stable leader. So that's why some of the students list Abe as not really positive, enthusiastic support, but out of kind of negative choice, some of the students prefer to have Abe as a prime minister.
Since we're on the topic of your students, how do you think that Trump, I mean, and what the U.S. has done since Trump has impacted your students' image of the U.S. so far? I mean, has it really gone down? Is it stable? Or how does the Trump presidency affect your students' views of the U.S.?
Maybe as I showed you in my slides, well, when you compare when you see the top 3 entries, Mr. Trump comes the first. 20% of the students list Trump as the biggest symbol, but the other entries are so diverse, from Statue of Liberty or even George Washington, Lincoln, all historical presidents, historical figures also come up in the entry choices. So the image of the US is still diverse, not necessarily dominated by this particular incumbent president. And then United States still remains the most favorite place to study abroad. So students go and study abroad when the choices is available to them. So I don't think the image has not going down because they go to McDonald's almost like once a week or so, and they use iPhone almost every day, I mean every hour, every single maybe minute or so. So the presence of America is ubiquitous. And the presence of America is diverse. It's like everywhere, ubiquitous. So I don't think the image of America has not been dominated by the incumbent president.
Richard Salmons, also from TUJ. Question for Paul. And probably just as we had the elections, everyone's into the debate for the 2020 presidential election. They got the race will be on for the candidates. And it looks like the debate is renewed between what we might call persuasion versus mobilization. I just read there was a nice op-ed in the New York Times arguing that Democrats don't need to persuade undecided voters in the middle. They just need to mobilize lots more of their core voters from the communities that will always vote Democrat. And I thought this was a great debate. Even some of my students were actually quite intrigued by this. So we need a political scientist here. Can you tell us, is there any scientific information, is there any numbers that would favor a strategy of persuasion of people in the middle versus just mobilization of more of your own people?
And if you have the right answer, you'll get a job as a political consultant.
Wow, that's a hard question. It's a great question, though. I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry. I wish I could pull a study off the top of my head. I'll take your card at the end of the night, and I'll promise I'll email you something, because I know there is.
Obvious numbers, we would say that don't worry about the middle, just go for your core, or vice versa. There's no figures which we can say would clearly favor one.
Right. Well, it was the Obama argument too, I think. I mean, that's why they were using, the big data. I mean, the idea is to identify the people that are your voters, and then turn them out. I just feel like that is kind of what American politics has become about. That you're not going to persuade anymore. People are so locked in. We're so tribal now in our politics that you don't really have a choice in that. People will not leave their tribes. So you just have to make sure, you know, that they show up. And that may be what's behind Trump's rallies. I mean, a lot of us thought during the campaign, for example, that he was making too much of these rallies. You know, he would talk about the 20,000 people, whoever were there, and we're thinking, yeah, but you need another few million if you're going to win that state. So don't get too, you know, excited about those 20,000 people that are showing up. But they seem to have an effect overall that was well beyond the people who attended. You know, first of all, they were broadcast, they were streamed, and CNN, right, would go to every Trump rally live, so he was reaching a much larger audience. And when, you know, right after the election, I had a panel of students some of whom worked on the Clinton campaign, and some worked on the Trump campaign. And I remember one young woman in particular, a nursing student, actually, who worked on the Trump campaign. It was a volunteer. And she talked about these rallies as being so important to sort of motivating her, that there was sort of this sense of community. She was not someone who was clearly in love, you know, with Donald Trump, and she wasn't really, you know, the sort of Trump or nobody. But she liked the feeling that she got out of these, and it was sort of very, very motivating. And, you know, if you look at where Trump went over the last couple months, and then you overlay the Senate map on that, one of the things you see is that he was going to the right places. You know, where he visited, the Senate candidate ended up doing well, in part because I think he was driving up turnout. Now, what he was saying was not attempting to persuade people who were on the fence to come and vote for him. In fact, you know, a lot of us were looking at it saying, this doesn't make sense. Why is he doubling down on these really controversial things like immigration that turns off a lot of voters? But if what you're saying, and what apparently the article that you're talking about is citing, that it's mobilization that we're talking about, then that makes sense, because he's speaking to the people who are already inclined to vote for him, but he's making sure that they're going to turn out. And he does that by, we would say, feeding them red meat, right? You know, giving them more of what they already think, to encourage them to show up. So the question, I think, on the other side then is, you know, what's the red meat for the Democrats? Is it just Trump? You know, is it just you better show up and vote, because if not, you're going to get a second term of Donald Trump? And the problem that the Democrats have right now is they don't really have a theme. Now, you can argue that Republican themes are turning off some voters, but they're also driving them up. They have something that they're voting for. You know, if you go and talk to voters in Northeast Ohio, you know, old manufacturing areas who supported Trump, you know, they will tell you. In fact, we had NHK sent a film crew to Ohio, and I went with them. I took them to sort of a local a Friday night fish fry, because, you know, a lot of people are Catholic and they eat fish on Fridays, and they go to church and they have these sort of community dinners that are a very big deal. And I took them there to interview voters. And the voters weren't just saying, we like Trump for no reason. They were able to list things. He said he was going to do this on trade, and he did. You know, they would go through things that he promised. So, you know, really, you know, I think you had Devin Stewart here, right, a few weeks ago, right? Yeah, and he sort of talked about this a little bit, that Trump has actually kept his promises. You may not like what his promises were, but, you know, if that attracted you, then keeping your promises is a way of motivating you to show up again. And it's going to be, I think 2020 is going to be very, very interesting. But I think you're right. It does seem that both sides are not really reaching out very much to the other. They're not interested in that anymore. They're just feeding their own voters and motivating them to turn out.
Thank you for a nice speech. And I'm Chandrika Panit from Nepal, and now I'm a graduate student at International Christian University. My question to Professor Miya is, I want to know about whether education system of Japan and curriculum of Japan support political socialization and political culture or not. This is my question to you. And one question, like somewhere in people's minds, they think that head of the state or president or prime minister should be some like a masculine character, because he has to face a problem like war. He have to make he have to think differently regarding that. So these kinds of factor affect in choosing the head of the state or not. So this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the elementary school level, there is a social 生活だから lifestyle classes that can touch on the political themes, but very generally because they are still elementary school students. So when you go up to the junior high, middle school, and high school, you have high school in particular, you have social science, ethics, and history, and that through taking those social science classes, they would learn how the diet and the political system works as a system in Japanese society and how it has been established historically. They learned all these historical background and contemporary problems through social science classes. And what they are now trying to expand in order to boost the younger generation's voting rate is to install civic education. I'm not sure about the right terminology that the Ministry of Education is trying to use, but they are trying to install more civic education to have more awareness of how your vote counts and matters in order to have better politics. So that's what they're going to install in, I think, the junior high school level. So you have this very general, very general classes in the elementary, and you have higher, more philosophical classes taught in high school, but in between, you have almost like very few. So what they're trying to do is now to install new classes, new courses, to have more awareness as a citizen.
Thomas Sullivan, Paul, I wanted to ask you just quickly about your impressions of the economic and fiscal consequences of this election. We know, for example, that Trump recently legislated some very large tax cuts for, certain parts of the American business community, and the United States is running pretty significant fiscal deficits as well. Defense spending is record highs. What do you think the House of Representatives will do to kind of curtail that? And it does strike me that the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and the OMB guy as well are Trump yes men. So I would suspect the Democrats will want to rein them in. I just wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, it's first of all, we have a potential shutdown coming. I think it's December 7th coming up that we'll have to come to some budget agreement. Mostly we're arguing about funds for the wall. I think that'll come in that. But I mean, what's happened so far and what might happen again is, it was almost amusing in that it's sort of, Democrats want more social spending. Republicans want more military spending, right? So they go at each other, and what happened during the last budget? They both said yes. Right? It's like, okay, we'll both spend what we want, and that's what's driving sort of the budget deficit. Then instead of having these fights, you have this kind of agreement. And Trump doesn't mind deficits. And he doesn't mind paying for things he doesn't like as long as he can get things that he likes. Now, you do have, a divided, twisted legislature now, right, with the Democrats and they're controlling one, the Republicans the other. They're going to have to come to some agreement. The last thing that I think either side wants is a government shutdown, because you never know how that's, particularly when you have both parties involved now, you never know who's going to get blamed. It's one thing if you have a Republican legislature and a Democratic president, then the Democratic president might say, they'll blame the Congress, they're not going to blame me. But now that they're both involved, it's going to be a lot harder to get around that. So I think they're going to be inclined to make a deal. We have a wild card in that we have all these new Democrats that are coming in who might be less inclined to make deals than their older, more senior colleagues. You just mentioned Ocasio-Cortez, right? The woman from New York. She's not going to compromise, particularly on defense spending and things like that. Now, there might not be enough of them that it makes a difference. But, I don't think there's anything that's going to drive down our spending. I mean, we're probably looking in the very near future at essentially $1 trillion a year deficit. Now, as a percentage of GDP, it's not awful. yet. I mean, we're not in the situation of Japan, for example, as a percentage of GDP. But, it's only going to get worse. We know entitlements are coming down the road. And how are we going to pay for that, with these tax cuts? Everyone knows there's a problem, but the more fiscally responsible, let's say, Republicans, they've either retired or have been voted out of office. So they're not there anymore. I don't know where that core is that cares about deficits, because the progressives say it doesn't matter, and now the conservatives say it's more important to fund our programs or what we want than to worry about deficits. So I don't know that there is an advocacy out there for it. So it's only going to get worse. We don't know how trade is going to play into this, because again, if you're talking about the overall fiscal health of the United States, how is this coming trade war, which I think is going to get much worse, particularly with regard to China, before it gets better? What's that going to do to the U.S. economy in the long run? Maybe more of a drag than anything we're talking about with tax policy. And again, I think the outcome of this election, if you're more liberal, you may be excited at the fact that Democrats did well in one house, but in terms of trade, these sort of senior Democrats have a history of being anti-trade. They're not going to try to rein in Trump on any of this. So there's almost no counterbalance anymore out there in the area of trade.
Okay, in the back, and so in the back here, yeah, and then, yeah, you, yeah. And then afterwards.
Hello, I'm Robert. Thank you for coming today. I was hoping to relate a question about 2 points that were made earlier. You were talking. One of the points was about the strategy, or at least that appears to be the strategy going into 2020 is about mobilization as opposed to persuasion. And in that sense, is it likely then that young voters will likely be a neutral factor if they weren't mobilized in the past, and it's about mobilizing the current bases, that is tapping into already likely voters? They'll be the focus point of strategies going into 2020. Does that mean, or would it be likely then to say that young voters will be a non-factor or a very negligible factor in 2020?
For me. Yes. And then I have a question for you. Okay. First of all, I did remember that there's an article called "The Myth of the Swing Voter." I think Campbell is the author, or it's a book chapter, but I have a reference that does make this argument about mobilization over persuasion, basically saying that persuasion has never worked. There's never really been a swing voter that's available to you. But I think the 2020 election is going to be very close. Sort of when you look at the map, particularly if Ohio is no longer a swing state. Ohio's got a lot of electoral votes. It's significant, more significant than in Arizona or in Nevada because of the number of electoral votes that you have. So if Ohio and Florida are no longer swing states, if they have become Republican states, with Arizona and Nevada, let's say, going the other way, we know it's going to be close. It's probably still going to come down to Michigan, to Pennsylvania, and we saw the narrow margins. If that's the case, then every voter matters, right? So there is going to be mobilization. But the problem is no one really knows how to mobilize young voters, how to get them to turn out in large numbers. No one's ever done it successfully. Harvard just did a big poll about a month ago of, I think it was 18 to 29-year-olds. I think that was the group. And basically 2/3 of them said they were uninterested in the midterm elections. So even with all the hype that's gone into this, with all the special elections, all the press coverage and everything, they're not interested. They're not excited about it. Now, the one issue, by the way, that according to this poll at least, that does seem to motivate young voters is immigration. And this might go to even how sort of young people see their country or see their country changing in a way that they might not be comfortable with. Because that does seem to be coming up in poll after poll, that immigration, even when generally in the United States, the only foreign policy issue, if that is a foreign policy issue, that Americans care about seems to be immigration. Trump has really brought it front and center. Now, it also drives voters on the other side. So I'm not sure Democrats know exactly what position they want to take on this. We're going to have this, so-called caravan, right, that's coming up from the south that's going to be a big event, I think, in the United States and how it's handled. And so far, Democrats, other than saying they're against what Trump is doing, haven't taken a position on the other side. What do they think about this? And in fact, there was just an article that I read, I think Foreign Affairs had it, where saying that, that one of the problems with the progressive side is they don't have a foreign policy. They don't have an immigration policy. It's not enough to simply be against everything the other side is doing. And again, once you take that position, you're going to start losing some voters. You're either going to lose moderate voters or you're going to lose voters on the left. So if immigration is going to be your issue to try to get young voters to turn out, well, you've got to be careful how much you're going to lose older voters. And remember, if I'm betting on who's going to turn out in 2020, I'm not going to bet on young voters. I'm going to bet on these older voters. They're more dependable. They're more habitual. They're going to show up. So, again, I'm going to have to be very careful on that. And that's what the Democrats, I think, are going to have to really think about in the coming year or so, is coming up with policies in these areas, whether they're trade or immigration. Because immigration does seem to be a really hot issue with young people, that they really care about it. The travel ban was very unpopular, particularly on campuses, in part because, we've got a lot of foreign students in the United States now. So you have this sort of interaction with them. And, we had students who worried they weren't going to come over. We had a professor who couldn't come in. So they actually see this issue, the issue of immigration, unlike trade, which is much more abstract or much more foreign policy issues. So that might be sort of the important issue if you're trying to drive up young voters, is immigration.
Thank you very much.
Let me ask a question to both of you. How do your students get the news? What do they read?
That's a very good question. What about you, students? Well, I think the impression that I've gotten is that they got the information through the media. I mean, the internet.
But, the internet can be the Financial Times, or it can be...
Yahoo News.
Or it can be
Yahoo.
It's not very serious. So what is it that they read on the internet? You know what's that?
Yahoo?
Line News.
Line News.
Maybe Twitter.
How many do you think read either online or on paper a serious newspaper? Asahi Shimbun, the New York Times, or Yomiuri, or whatever.
I haven't done survey on that, so next time I will talk about it. But my impression is that although the students are very serious, but they didn't really know the different tone of the newspaper, that I have to explain that Sankei and Tokyo Shimbun, and then they don't know the difference between the tones or their attitudes, political attitudes, or so their opinions. So they don't really widely read the newspapers, unlike our parents' generation. They're already moving away from the written newspaper. They don't subscribe them.
I mean, they don't read newspapers. And I mean, BuzzFeed, as a news source in the United States, is actually very popular with young people. In fact, two of my former students are reporters. One is the court reporter, and the other is a political reporter for BuzzFeed. And I'm never more popular than when they find out I know these two reporters, because they were former students. And and some of BuzzFeed news is actually good. I mean, they do some in-depth reporting. There is some, but a lot of it is the top 3 reasons you should be against this or that. They love lists. Everything is lists. It seems to attract young people. They keep it simple, bullet points. I guess we use too much PowerPoint now. But you'd be shocked at how uninterested. They're much more interested in the United States and what's happening with the Kardashians than what's happening in Congress. And, it might just be, they're going to get older. This is sort of what my argument always sort of about, being young is not a chronic condition. We all know that, right? You grow out of it, right? So, they will engage eventually, and some of it's just their time of life. They're not settled right now. and they're not thinking. They're thinking about tomorrow. They're not thinking about a long-term future at this point. So they're not really engaged. But yeah, BuzzFeed is very big, and they get their news from Yahoo News, which, you know, sort of a news feed. I don't use any of these things, so I'm not really familiar with how they work. But they're not reading the Financial Times. I will tell you that, or The Economist, unless we assign it to them.
Kashiwagi-sensei? Yeah, you had a question, yeah.
Hi, Kashiwagi is my name. I'm just getting confused about the U.S. politics. We've been talking about the tribes, and then mobilization is more important than persuasion, and the swing states are sort of disappearing, but we still have this red states, blue states. Not only about 2020, but what will be the U.S. sort of political landscape 20, 30 years from now? Will this red state, blue state continue? And the US will have to change their name to Divided States of America? Or how is the United States going to be the United States? Are the young people sort of going to change this, or what is your view?
Harold Wilson, British Prime Minister, said a week is a long time in politics, but we'll ask first the political scientist and then the historian, or vice versa.
I mean, you know, it's really hard to make predictions for the future, but we've never seen, I think, I mean, you know, we have the Civil War. I mean, there's times when we were shooting at each other. We're not doing that yet. But, you know, the problem now is modern technology and the internet, and you know, people get to self-select their news, and it's just increasing the divide so much because you never have to read something that you disagree with. You know, we have these news feeds, and there's conservative news feeds, there's liberal news feeds, so all you're getting is a reinforcement of your own bias, and this is not healthy. It's really terrible. We can have debates, and I don't think young people are any better than their elders on this. They're very locked in too. We're seeing in U.S. universities, it's extremely difficult to have a political debate because people don't want to hear something that disagrees with their prior opinion. This is not healthy. You know, this is really, really not good. You put on top of this the fact that incredibly we're such an evenly divided country. I mean, you know, you looked at sort of Florida, right? And for a while when I was watching the returns on Tuesday night, you know, millions of people are voting, and it's 50-50. You know, it's really, you know, amazing how close our elections are, how close, not only are we divided, but we're so closely divided in this that, you know, it does seem that, you know, we're one match away from, you know, starting that fire that we don't know what we're going to do with. I think it's very worrying to all of us, regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, that we are looking more like the divided states of America than the United States of America. Now, the problem is, when you take that together with this mobilization idea, is, well, we're a 50-50, it's really close, you can't persuade anybody, you've got to light a fire under your people. You know, you've got to get them motivated, so you're going to, you know, make these arguments. We've never seen the kind of political rhetoric that we have in the United States right now. With, you know, it's not just that you're wrong, but you're absolutely evil. You know, our politics has gotten religious, in a sense, and you know, and this passion it's good if you want to drive up turnout, but it's very bad for a country that is, you know, the united separate things, right? United States. We're not really one country, right? We're 50 different countries, and we're starting to fray, and it's very, very scary as an American to see this happening. Nobody knows what to do about it, though, because technology is just making it worse.
Well, maybe as a census historian, when you look at the 2010 census, we have the Asian Americans was about 5% of the population, or maybe less, and Hispanics was about 16%, and then there is a projection saying that the demographic change will continue to continue this trend that by the year to 2050, majority-minority relationship will be, now minority will become majority in terms of numbers, and it's not really, Hispanics is growing in large numbers, and they're rapidly growing, but actually the highest pace, the group that's increasing its population, the highest rate is Asian American. Asian population is growing the fastest pace. So in Hispanics, Latinos, Asians, African Americans, and other minorities combined, they will become half of America's population in the near future. So we'll see that the trend will go on, dramatically change the landscape or face of America, for sure, in 2020 census, coming census, in 2 years. So what do you make of that? I mean, well, because you're going to have surely demographic change because of immigration, the high birth rate of recent immigrants. So we're going to have this demographic change for sure. So what you're going to impact on the US politics? So it's going to more divisive issue, us versus them, minority versus majority, non-Hispanic, white versus other minorities. What do you make of these issues?
What we don't know is, I'm good at that, right? But what we don't know is how these groups are going to evolve politically. You know, African American voters, solidly Democratic, and we probably don't expect that to change. But the other groups you're talking about are not as solidly Democratic as African Americans are. Hispanics, Hispanic Americans, remember, are, you know, they tend to be Catholic. This makes them more socially conservative in issues like abortion. The Republicans have always thought that someday they would get the Hispanic vote, particularly second generation, third generation. In fact, this was, you know, the Bush family was very big on this and doing this. In fact, and that's why they were so upset with Trump, because they're saying that we need these voters in the future, and you're turning off those voters with your immigration policy. You're right, Asian Americans are the fastest growing group, but remember, that's a very wide label. And if you look within the subgroups, generally, by the way, Japanese Americans aren't even counted because there aren't enough numbers to try to get a read on them politically. But Chinese Americans, and that's sort of one of the largest growing groups, are among the most conservative liberals. Overall, Asian Americans are very liberal and tend to support Democrats. But, you know, Chinese voters are the most conservative within that, Chinese Americans. And again, that's where the growth seems to be. So you can't really predict where they're going to go politically. The more interesting question is what it does to our sort of political divisions and the hardening of that. And I would really have to think about that. I can't answer that off the top of my head.
I think also to comment on what Paul was saying, I think there's a difference in terms of what you described in how the U.S. has divided the polarization, and that if you look at what the top Republicans have said, starting with Trump, it is vastly more inflammatory than what most of the top Democrats have said. I think if you looked, I mean, Trump praises a member of Congress who physically assaulted a journalist, the enemies of the people. If you compare what Nancy Pelosi says, it is not as inflammatory, it is not as violent. So I think we're not in a situation where like both sides are equal in terms of how they inflame the debate and in how they make the politics much more polarized. I mean, there's a difference between Hillary Clinton calling them deplorables and, Trump basically praising violence against the press, racially charged remarks by a large number of Republican candidates. So I think it's very different from the Republican Party you had under Ronald Reagan or under Bush, for that matter. I know what you think.
But I think Democrats are trying to catch up. I think in this too. I mean, again, what Kurt Vonnegut said, right? Be careful of your enemy because that's the person you're going to most become like. And I think you are seeing a sort of counter reaction. The rhetoric is jumping up. Like Democrats do refer to Republicans as Nazis. It's not the leadership. It's not Hillary Clinton's not saying this. Nancy Pelosi's not saying this. But look on the internet, and you'll see it every day on Facebook on these postings. So I can't remember what this is called that I think you're accusing me of, but both sidesism, right? That you're not supposed to do that now, and just the fact that we use the term that both sidesism, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to say, well, this side's bad, but this side's bad too. I don't think we get anywhere with that. I mean, I think that the rhetoric is bad on both sides and growing worse, and I don't think it's helpful to say, well, they're worse than we are. What we need to figure out is there any middle there still? Is there any sort of common dialogue that we can have? And there's no money in that, right? There's no votes in that, and that I think is our really big problem.
Miya, you want to make a few concluding remarks? Well, thank you very much to all the audience, and of course first and foremost our speakers. So thank you, Miya. Thank you, Paul. And I would also like to thank Enrico, who's not here, and all the student workers here. Raise your hands, student workers at ICAS, who make this possible. Thank you. And next week we have a talk on human trafficking and exploitation, and we'll have also a session later on bringing RIMPAC to the South China Sea. As well as a talk by Ken Calder on his latest book. And we have other events coming up. If you're not on our email list, put your business cards in here and we'll add you to the list. So thanks again, and I'm sorry not everybody got to ask a question, but we have to vacate the room pretty quickly.